It was just a simple portrait of three young women, but look more closely at what they're doing with their fingers. Professor Catherine Ellis had spent 12 years as curator of American photography at the Boston Historical Society, examining countless images from the Victorian era. But on a humid afternoon in July, she encountered a photograph that would consume the next 2 years of her life. The portrait arrived in a donation box from the estate of the Henshaw family in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Inside were dozens of daguerreotypes, tintypes, and cabinet cards documenting 4 generations of New England life. Most showed typical scenes from the late 19th century: stiff-backed merchants, children in Sunday clothes, formal wedding portraits. But one image made Catherine stop mid-catalog. 3 young women stared back through time. They appeared to be sisters, ranging in age from perhaps 16 to 24. All 3 had similar features: the same delicate nose, the same wide-set eyes, the same determined set to their jaw. They wore matching dark Victorian dresses with high lace collars and cameo brooches pinned at their throats. Their hair was styled identically, pulled back in the severe fashion popular in the mid-1880s. The composition was unremarkable. They stood in a photographer's studio against a painted backdrop showing a library scene with leather-bound books and heavy drapes. The lighting was professional, the exposure perfectly timed for the era's long photographic process. What caught Catherine's attention wasn't the backdrop or the clothing or even their serious expressions, which were typical for the period when photographers demanded absolute stillness during exposures that could last several seconds. It was their hands. Catherine had examined thousands of Victorian portraits. Subjects typically kept their hands still and natural, folded demurely, resting on props, or hanging at their sides. Photographers of that era were obsessed with stillness. Every element had to be controlled, planned, intentional. These hand positions looked too specific, too deliberate to be random poses chosen for aesthetic reasons. She lifted her magnifying glass, studying the image more carefully. The youngest sister's interlaced fingers created what looked almost like a symbol. The middle sister's raised hand formed a distinct shape. The eldest sister's extended fingers seemed to point at precise angles. Catherine photographed the portrait with her high-resolution camera, uploading it to her laptop. On screen, magnified to fill her monitor, the details became even more striking. She could see the texture of the fabric, the intricate lacework on their collars, even the slight differences in their expressions. The eldest looked determined, the middle sister appeared anxious, the youngest seemed almost defiant. But it was the hands that held her attention. She zoomed in until each finger filled the frame. The positioning was unmistakable. This wasn't casual. This wasn't accidental. The eldest sister's thumb crossed deliberately over her palm in a way that required conscious effort. Her extended fingers created angles that would have been uncomfortable to hold during the long exposure. The middle sister's splayed V-shape was so specific that Catherine could see the tension in her hand muscles. The youngest sister's interlaced fingers formed a pattern so complex it must have taken practice to maintain. Catherine had studied Victorian communication systems, the language of flowers, the symbolism of colors, the meaning of fans. She knew that women in the 19th century often used subtle signals to convey messages that couldn't be spoken aloud. But hand positioning in photographs? That was new. She opened her database of women's history and reform movements in 1880s New England. The suffrage movement had been gaining momentum. Women's rights activists, temperance advocates, and abolitionists had created networks across Massachusetts. Some had used coded communications, secret meetings, and visual signals to organize their work. Her phone buzzed. Her colleague, Dr. Marcus Bellamy, a specialist in Victorian women's studies at Harvard, responded to her earlier text. "Free tomorrow morning. What did you find?" Catherine typed back, 3 sisters who might have been sending messages through photography. Bring your sources on women's secret societies and reform networks. Marcus arrived at the Historical Society at 9 sharp, carrying a leather portfolio filled with research materials. Catherine had the portrait projected on the wall of her research room, larger than life. The 3 sisters gazed down at them with quiet intensity. Look at their hands, Catherine said, pointing with a laser pointer. Every finger positioned deliberately. This isn't random. Marcus approached the projection, adjusting his glasses. He was silent for a long moment, studying each sister's hand positioning. Then he set down his portfolio and pulled out a thick folder. In the 1870s and 1880s, women's reform organizations faced significant opposition, he began. They couldn't always meet openly. They couldn't always speak freely. So they created parallel systems of communication. He spread documents across the table. Newspaper articles about women's temperance meetings being disrupted by angry mobs. Court records of suffragists being arrested for trying to vote. Personal letters describing the dangers women faced when advocating for their rights. These weren't just social clubs, Marcus continued. These were organized networks working to change laws, protect women, fight for voting rights, and challenge a system that treated them as property. Many operated in semi-secrecy, especially in conservative communities. Catherine picked up a letter dated 1884, written by a Boston suffragist. We must be clever in our methods. Direct confrontation brings violence. But there are other ways to identify our allies, to share information, to build our movement without drawing the attention of those who would destroy it. Secret methods, Catherine said quietly. Visual signals that looked innocent but meant something specific to those who understood. Marcus nodded. Exactly. And what better way to document membership, to create a permanent record of your network, than through photography? It looks like an ordinary family portrait, but to other network members who know the code. It's a declaration, Catherine finished. A permanent record that they were part of something. The embossed studio name proved to be the breakthrough. Harrison and Sons Photography had operated from a building on Tremont Street from 1872 until 1891. Catherine found references in the Boston City Directory and old advertisements in women's periodicals. But it was an article in an 1886 issue of The Woman's Journal, a suffragist newspaper, that changed everything. Tucked in the back pages among advertisements for corsets and patent medicines was a small notice: ladies seeking documentation of membership may contact Harrison and Sons Photography, Tremont Street. Discreet service provided. References required. Documentation of membership, Marcus read aloud. Not family portraits. Not social photography. Documentation. Catherine searched deeper into Harrison and Sons' history. The studio had been founded by two brothers, William and Charles Harrison, sons of an abolitionist minister. The brothers had continued their father's tradition of activism, but adapted it to a new cause: women's rights. In the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Catherine found a journal kept by Charles Harrison from 1882 to 1890. March 15, 1885, 3 sisters from Cambridge. Position 7 completed successfully. Beautiful subjects, strong resolve. Position 7. Catherine's pulse quickened. She flipped through the journal, finding similar entries. Position 3. Position 12. Position 1, Variation B. These weren't random notations. They were codes. Specific hand positions that corresponded to different meanings, different levels of involvement, different roles within the reform networks. Marcus contacted Dr. Jennifer Wu, a cryptography historian at MIT who specialized in visual communication systems. Jennifer arrived that afternoon, intrigued by Catherine's cryptic phone call about Victorian women and coded hand signals. Visual codes in the 19th century were surprisingly sophisticated, Jennifer explained, examining the projected portrait. The language of flowers allowed women to send complex messages through bouquet arrangements. Fans could convey entire conversations. Handkerchiefs, jewelry, even the way you wore your gloves, all could communicate information. She photographed the sisters' hand positions from multiple angles, then opened her laptop and began creating digital overlays, tracing the exact angles and positions of each finger. "Let's approach this systematically," Jennifer said. If this is a code, each hand position likely represents something specific. Not letters, too complex for a photograph where you have to hold still. More likely categories, affiliations, roles. Plus informal networks, Catherine added. Women helping other women escape abusive marriages, find employment, access education, obtain medical care, all things that were legally and socially restricted. Jennifer studied the hand positions intensely. The eldest sister's position, thumb crossed, 2 fingers extended, could indicate leadership or senior membership. The middle sister's dual hand position, one at her collar, one at her side, that's complex, possibly indicating multiple affiliations or a transitional role. The youngest sister's interlaced fingers forming that specific pattern, that could be an identifier, like a signature or category marker. In one photograph, 2 women stood side by side, their hands forming matching symbols. In another, a single woman sat in a chair, her fingers creating a complex interlaced pattern nearly identical to the youngest sister in the original portrait. In a third, 5 women arranged in a line each displayed different hand positions, like a visual alphabet. It's not just one code, Jennifer said finally. It's a complete system. Multiple signals that could be combined to convey different meanings. Someone created this system, taught it to network members, and Harrison and Sons documented it through photography. Marcus made the connection that broke everything open. While researching women's property rights cases in Massachusetts courts from the 1880s, he found a pattern. Dozens of women had successfully obtained legal separations from abusive husbands, secured property rights, or gained custody of their children, rare victories in an era when women had almost no legal standing. Many of these cases shared the same lawyer, a woman named Adelaide Porter. Porter had been one of the first women admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1882. Court records showed she won an unusual number of cases for female clients during a period when women's legal rights were severely restricted. More significantly, her case files often included photographic evidence, portraits of women, documentation of their respectability, proof of their character. She was using Harrison and Sons photographs in court, Catherine realized. Not just as identity verification, but as evidence of these women's involvement in respectable reform networks. Their hand positions served as verification of their affiliations. In Porter's archived case files at the Boston Public Library, Marcus found letters. Correspondence between Porter and other activists, teachers, doctors, ministers, discussing verification protocols and documentation systems. One letter, dated April 1885, was particularly revealing. Porter wrote to a minister in Cambridge, "We have successfully documented 47 women through our photographic system. Harrison Brothers continue to provide discreet service. The hand positioning protocol allows us to encode essential information, primary affiliation, leadership status, and verification level, that can be confirmed later if needed." Each portrait serves as both dignified representation and practical documentation for legal purposes. Catherine sat back, stunned. They had built an entire documentation system. When women needed proof of their character, evidence of their respectability, verification of their reform work, they could present these portraits that looked like innocent family photographs but contained layers of encoded information for those who knew how to read them. With the network structure emerging, Catherine became obsessed with identifying the 3 sisters in the original portrait. The Henshaw family estate had come from a brownstone in Cambridge, a neighborhood with a strong tradition of reform activism and women's education. The Historical Society's donor records provided the seller's name, Dorothy Henshaw, age 78, who had inherited the property from her aunt. Catherine called Dorothy that evening. Dorothy had a sharp, clear voice despite her age. When Catherine described the portrait in detail, 3 young women in matching dark dresses with specific hand positions, Dorothy's tone changed. "That would be the Patterson sisters," she said quietly. "My great aunts. Margaret, Elizabeth, and Charlotte. This photograph came from Aunt Charlotte's estate. Can you tell me about them?" Catherine asked. Dorothy was silent for a moment. They were remarkable women. All 3 were educated at the Cambridge School for Girls. Margaret, the eldest, became a teacher. Elizabeth worked with the temperance movement. Charlotte was the youngest, the rebellious one. She spoke publicly for women's suffrage, which scandalized the family. Were they involved in any organizations together? Any groups or societies? Oh yes, Dorothy replied. They were very active. My grandmother, that's their younger sister Sarah, always said they were part of some network. Women helping women, she called it. They assisted women who needed legal help, who were trapped in bad situations, who needed resources or education. Catherine's pulse quickened. Did your grandmother ever mention anything about hand signals? Codes? Ways they identified each other? Dorothy laughed softly. Actually, yes. She said they had a secret way of recognizing allies. Something about how they positioned their hands. I always thought it was just a family story, a bit of romance about the old days. Dorothy, I think your great-aunts were part of something very significant. A network that used photography to document and verify their reform work. Would you be willing to share what you know about them? With Dorothy's permission and enthusiasm, Catherine and Marcus began tracing the Patterson sisters' connections. Church records from First Parish Church in Cambridge showed all three sisters as members from 1880 through the early 1900s. They served on various committees: the Ladies' Aid Society, the Missionary Committee, the Sunday School Board. But the meeting minutes revealed something more structured. Specific notations appeared next to certain names, small symbols that looked decorative but, Catherine now realized, corresponded to the hand positions in the photographs. Margaret Patterson's name always appeared with a small mark that matched her hand position in the portrait, thumb crossed, two fingers extended. Elizabeth's entries showed a different symbol. Charlotte's showed the complex interlaced pattern she had displayed in the photograph. They were cross-referencing, Marcus explained. The church records identified women who needed help. Harrison and Sons photographed them with appropriate hand codes. Porter used the photographs in legal proceedings. And the church records kept track of everything, hidden in plain sight within routine committee documentation. Catherine found more photographs in the Harrison and Sons archive. The collection contained over 200 portraits showing the hand positioning system, all created between 1882 and 1890. Each image carefully numbered, each one documenting women who had been systematically excluded from power and legal protection. She identified other network members. A doctor named Sarah Mitchell who provided medical care to women who couldn't access male physicians. A boarding house owner named Ruth Chen who gave shelter to women fleeing dangerous situations. A professor at Wellesley College named Catherine Stone who helped women obtain education. Each woman had risked her reputation, her livelihood, sometimes her safety, to help others. Together, they had created something powerful, a network that operated alongside the legal system when that system failed women, which was most of the time. 4 months into her research, Catherine organized an exhibition at the Boston Historical Society. She displayed 30 portraits from the Harrison and Sons collection, each showing the hand positioning system, each accompanied by the story she had uncovered about the women photographed. Dorothy Henshaw attended the opening, bringing her daughter and 2 granddaughters. For generations of Patterson descendants stood before the portrait of Margaret, Elizabeth, and Charlotte, seeing their great-aunt's quiet rebellion properly honored for the first time. But the exhibition's most powerful moment came when other descendants arrived. Catherine had located families connected to 18 of the photographed women. Each brought pieces of the story, fragments of oral history, old letters, faded documents that suddenly made sense within the network's context. An elderly woman named Grace Porter stood before a portrait of Adelaide Porter, the lawyer, photographed with her hands forming the leadership position. "I always knew she was important," Grace said quietly, tears in her eyes. "But I never knew the full extent. Never knew she was part of something this organized, this brave." A man named Thomas Mitchell examined a portrait of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, his great-great-grandmother. Family stories said she lost her medical license for treating women who couldn't pay. "Looking at this now, I think she was doing much more than charity work. She was part of a resistance movement. 6 months after discovering the portrait, Catherine stood in the Historical Society's conservation lab, carefully handling the original cabinet card of the Patterson sisters. They had digitally preserved all 30 portraits from the exhibition, each image now accessible to descendants and researchers. But she kept returning to Margaret, Elizabeth, and Charlotte. 3 young women who had posed in a Boston photography studio in 1885, their hands carefully positioned in codes that would preserve their story across more than a century. Dorothy had donated the sisters' personal papers to the Historical Society. Among them was a letter written by Charlotte Patterson in 1886, addressed to her younger sister Sarah. "Yesterday we had our portrait made at Harrison & Sons. Margaret insisted we all go together, to document our work before time scatters us. The photographer was very kind, understanding what we needed without explanation. We held our positions for nearly a minute while the exposure was made. My hands ached afterward from holding that complicated pattern, but it was important. This photograph will matter, Sarah. Someday people will understand what we built here. How we helped each other when the law would not. How we created systems of support and verification when official channels excluded us. How we refused to accept that women were helpless or powerless. Our hands in this photograph tell the truth that we cannot always speak aloud. We are organized, we are purposeful, we are fighting for change. And we will not stop until every woman has the rights and protections she deserves." She had been right. The photograph had mattered. The network had operated most actively from 1882 to 1891, helping hundreds of women before gradually evolving as some activists died, others moved, and new organizations emerged with more public visibility. William and Charles Harrison had closed their studio in 1891 when Charles died unexpectedly. William continued photography work until 1898 but never resumed the documentation project. Adelaide Porter had practiced law until 1904, continuing to fight for women's rights through increasingly public channels as the suffrage movement gained momentum. The Patterson sisters had all lived long lives. Margaret taught for 40 years. Elizabeth's temperance work contributed to eventual prohibition laws. Charlotte lived to vote in 1920, seeing women's suffrage finally achieved at age 55. Catherine met regularly with descendants now, collecting oral histories, connecting families who shared this hidden heritage. The portrait of the 3 sisters had become iconic, reproduced in textbooks about women's history, featured in documentaries about social reform movements. But for Catherine, its power remained deeply personal. She thought of Charlotte Patterson's hands, forming that complex interlaced pattern in a Boston studio in 1885. Holding the position for a full minute despite the discomfort, because the message mattered more than the pain. Those hands had created a code that outlived her, that carried her story and the story of hundreds of women across 140 years. Hands that had written letters, taught children, marched for suffrage, helped other women escape danger, and, in one carefully documented moment, declared through photography, "We exist, we organize, we resist, we fight for justice." The Harrison brothers' journal contained one final entry that Catherine had found particularly moving. Written by Charles Harrison in December 1890, a few months before his death. "We have photographed nearly 300 women using the position system. Each portrait represents courage, women who risk social condemnation to fight for their rights, who help others at personal cost, who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. When I adjust the camera and ask them to hold their hand positions, I see determination in their faces. These photographs are my life's most important work. Not the landscapes or the society portraits or the commercial commissions. These women, with their coded hands and quiet defiance, are history itself unfolding before my lens. And I am honored to document their revolution, one carefully positioned hand at a time." In the end, the simplest gestures could contain the most profound truths. 3 sisters, standing in a photographer's studio, moving their hands into specific patterns. A small act. A deliberate choice. A message that would echo through generations: we were here, we resisted, and we will not be forgotten. Sometimes you just needed to look closely enough at their hands to see the revolution.